Not many people out there in modern Wales would warm openly, I guess, to the idea of worshipping yourself. Wouldn't be a good look, would it? But then consider these two things. For what it's worth, the word worship comes from Old English words worth and sheep, meaning worth and ship. Translates as worship, the idea of giving worth to someone. Secondly, post-nonconformist, post-revival era Welsh culture drifted away into singing and liberal theology. The first one, the singing, exercising the emotional life of the nation, and the second, leaving the culture racked by the impact of moralising without grace and forgiveness from the pulpit. And those two factors have left much of modern Wales, especially but not exclusively, its indigenous Welsh-speaking people, living in an emotionally sensitive, unashamed culture, looking increasingly frantically, as secularism accelerated, for ways to rescue its honour and mitigate its shame. In that context, the secular love yourself false gospel has stepped into the spiritual gap and has been advocating for its love yourself, value yourself, please yourself, do what's good for you message, doing so in increasingly frantic ways. Why increasingly frantically? Well, because it doesn't work. Especially so when other people don't agree much with the you are so worthy message you're trying to persuade yourself of. We know we're not the people we ought to be, and the awareness and experience of God's free grace to unworthy people is what we actually need. But we find that initially threatening. We feel reluctant to go anywhere near it because it initially faces up to and confronts our unworthiness before dealing with it. Now, against that background, I've been reading a book on honour and shame cultures, honour-shame cultures. It's mainly about honour-shame cultures overseas. Pops up in the origins of ISIS and a number of other fascinating settings. But honestly, there's such a lot in common with post-1904 revival Welsh Valleys culture and with parts of the chapel and church culture of 21st century rural Wales. And the irony is that so many of the Bible stories this honour-shame arrangement of culture characterised by, it's so common here too, and also plays into the Lord's take on that mindset. Particularly, we can usefully follow this through in the famous parable in Luke 18 about two men who go up to chapel in order to worship, and to do so in very different ways. So Luke 18:9 says, "To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. And the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, 'God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get.' But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, 'God, have mercy on me, a sinner.' I tell you, this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Okay, then, let's try and deep dive into this story. In verses 9 to 10, you've got the scenario set out as to what's going on in the background. And first off, of course, you've got the hearers. To some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else. Well, that's who's listening. Confident of their own righteousness, looking down on everyone else. Amazing how those two things go together, isn't it? Confidence in your own righteousness seems to fuel itself, manage insecurities about the assertion of being righteous within yourself. It seems to cling to any confidence about itself by knocking other people down and climbing up on them. And that's the expression of the inner Pharisee we seem to have rioting about within us like a spoiled child. Climbing up on the fallen bodies of others that we have felled is really not going to give you a secure footing in your climb. People say, don't they, well, I'm not as bad as he is, or, yeah, okay, well, yeah, I do things wrong, but I'm not a sinner like him. That's the sort of thing. And if you're climbing up on the bodies of people you've felled, it's going to be hard to keep your footing. Especially when you aren't a confident climber yourself. But the story Jesus uses to illustrate how insecure that footing is not one but two men in it to portray the contrast between them. So there's the context in which it's all taking place. There were people there who were confident in their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else. And then there were two men who come into the story. Luke 18, verse 10. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. Now that's two very different people. And while the audience in front of Jesus that day would be cheering for one, they'd be jeering at the other, knocking one category of people down to join the other in climbing up over the fallen bodies of the ones they've just knocked down. See, these Pharisees, they vaunted their supposed self-righteousness and despised the sin they attributed to the tax collectors, the other people, who had a reputation, of course, for profiteering from their alliance with godless foreign oppressors, doing that for their own personal benefit at the expense of their own Jewish people. Yabu sucks, everybody be shouting. But who'd have thought it? These two very differently regarded people in the honour-shame culture of that first century Jewish culture, two very differently regarded people went up to the temple to pray. But it was the same temple. The same two different guys, but there was the same temple in the story. Now, one of those guys was very naturally at home in the temple, honoured there, appreciated there, floating in the warm bubble bath of approval there. So much more difficult for the other guy to ever step into the temple courts. The opposite would be true of him and his reception there. Now, how can we begin to understand that? If you are from an indigenous Welsh background, you're Pobl Wreiddiol, the original people of the land, you can step into your own chapel, the place where you were sent to Sunday school, where you grew up, where you got married, where you buried your parents and other family members. And it's like you're in a place you're supposed to be in, where to some extent you fit in and belong. It's you, a chapel. But when you're invited to somebody else's, you feel much more exposed, much more dependent on the hospitality of the person or the family that have invited you while you're there. It can be uncomfortable. You don't feel at home. Now, you can magnify that because the tax collector going up there is in a far more uncomfortable situation than that. But he knows that he needs to find not self-justification in chapel, but he's desperate there to find the mercy of God. And the contrast between both men's words and behaviour there are crucial. So there's the basic background of what's happening, the scenario. But what we find inside that scenario is that out of the heart of a man, that man speaks. First of all, the Pharisee in verses 11 to 12. The Pharisee stance, the way he stands, look at it. Body language is so revealing, isn't it? Beginning of verse 11. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed. Well, it just says that he stood and he's going to be praying to himself. He's standing up. He's not hiding away somewhere quietly and praying. It says he prayed to himself. Something contemporary translators seem to think inexplicable and not possible. They go in a different direction. He just stood there and prayed to himself. He has no compunction standing in the middle of the temple court with people all around him, displaying his own righteousness in this way. And before we jeer him, because it is our interest to knock people down in our quest perhaps to build ourselves up, just think about all the ways we demonstrate our righteousness before others. In our individualistic, performative, Instagram, Meta, Facebook culture. To seem similarly keen to be seen by people. But more significantly, we've looked at his stance. Let's look at his words. Verses 11 to 12. The Pharisee stood and prayed to himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other people. Listen to this exceptionalism. I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. How often when we chat to somebody and say, look, we're all sinners, they say, but it's the others. I thank you I'm not like other people, God. They're robbers, they're evildoers, they're adulterers, not me. Or even like this tax collector. Look how the man is vaunting himself. Firstly, it's competitive. He's here to diss the tax collector. Our culture is so judgmental, isn't it? We fear that in our honour-shame culture. You can see that on the pages of Instagram any day of the week. Secondly, it's performative, demonstrating its claimed righteousness, its self-righteousness. I fast twice a week. Religious observance, dressed up tidy to be seen going in a nice car, washed, freshly polished, with clean and well-behaved children to chapel on Sunday. Yes. Oh, yeah. And I give a tenth of all I get, he says. Doing sponsored this and that and the other activity, posted prominently again on social media, doing things for the local school, visibly giving to charity, making sure there's a large number next to your name in the annual adroddiad from the chapel, from the family chapel every year. And here's the Pharisee publishing on his equivalent of social media of his day in the open square, the open court of the temple. There he is. God, I thank you I'm not like these other people. Robbers, evildoers, adulterers, even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. Give a tenth of all I get. Now let's compare the tax collector. Verse 13, the tax collector, out of his heart his mouth speaks too. Verse 13, but the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Let's look again at the tax collector's stance then. The tax collector took up his stance. He stood at a distance. At a distance, not in the middle of everybody where they would all see him. And he wouldn't even look up to heaven. Not even that presumptuous. And he beat his breast in grief. That's an expression of grief in that culture. He senses, he recognizes, he expresses publicly his own unworthiness. And no doubt it was uncomfortable, but it was authentic. And it expressed openly and honestly in that same honour-shame culture, in that same temple as the other guy, where people were absolutely going to judge him. It expressed there the truth about the sins of his own heart. How did he express himself? Not praying to himself, but genuinely and sincerely to God. Tax collector's words, very brief, Luke 18, verse 13. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Not running from it, you see. He's confessing it. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. God, he's up the temple seeking God. Not like the other guy who was actually up the temple seeking himself. God, he says, be merciful to me. No doubt what he's up the temple to get out of it. He's using the temple for what it was designed for and set apart by God to do, to get mercy for sinners through all the rituals and stuff that went on. I am a sinner. That, not the Pharisees' words, express honesty, sincerity, integrity in dealing with God. Well, there's the drama in the story. What's the point? Verse 14. Jesus teaches. He teaches the point of the story, makes it plain and very clear. I tell you, this man, that is the tax collector who was honest, open about his own failures and faults, this man, rather than the other, not the other, but this one, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, those who humble themselves will be exalted, says the Lord. Here's the practical outcome then. It's all to do with being justified or not being justified by God. And the clear message is that, Jesus says, I tell you, this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. Well, understandable enough, I suppose, given the first guy, the Pharisee, wasn't talking to God at all. He was talking to himself. He was so busy justifying himself, he wasn't addressing the question that was the point of the temple of getting right in the eyes of God. And that's what he needed. But the other guy, the tax collector, the one everybody despised, displays honesty and integrity and sincerity in seeking God with a plea for the forgiveness that actually both of the men in the story knew deep down they needed. There's the practical outcome. This man, rather than the other, went home justified before God, says Jesus. And then Jesus goes on to give the principled reason for that in Luke 18:15. Get this. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. There's the essential principle. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. All that stuff with social media, all that trying to set up what a wonderful person you are, all that resort when we sense our own failures and inadequacies to trying to show how good we are. All those who do that will be humbled, says God. But those who humble themselves, confessing their fault and casting themselves on the mercy of God through Jesus, will be exalted. In the words of Mary's song, the Magnificat, in Luke 1:52, he has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble, and that is what God delights to do. So the bottom line, the absolutely fundamental principle, is the sort of self-exaltation and self-justification that our culture seems to thrive on. Gets pretty close to being an unforgivable sin, certainly unforgivable as long as you stay there, where that Pharisee was, because he didn't go home justified before God, whereas the guy who coughed up the truth about himself, threw himself on the mercy of God, as a sinner, is the guy who went home right with God. So what's the point to take away? Be like the tax collector, not the Pharisee. Not in what he did wrong, but in what he then went on to do right. The way to deal with that sense of human failure, inadequacy, of not being good enough, or even simply not being enough, the way to deal with that is common to every human being who is not diagnosably unwell, wherever you find human beings on the face of the planet. Unless they're deluded, this is their actual experience. We need to out that fact, because not outing it isn't just bad for our mental health, but bad for our enjoyment of life and of eternal life. One man went home from the temple that day justified, and it wasn't the one busy to justify himself. It wasn't the one everybody listening to the story thought he was going to be. It wasn't the one who'd made himself look righteous in their eyes. It was the one who was real about his own realities, knew only God was the one who was going to fix him over all these problems, and cast himself openly on the mercy of God. And that is the very heart of what Jesus came to show us. And I hope that's an encouragement, and not a reason to run and take refuge from the storm of this message. No need to run. Every reason to take yourself to a place quietly. Pour out your heart to God. Find that assurance of your own issues being forgiven and restored to fellowship with Him. God bless you. Have a great week. Openly coming, I am a sinner, to Jesus.